It's tempting to think of America's recession and financial crisis as a single event, spreading evenly across the country, touching each family, each city, each region at the same time and in the same way. The real picture is, of course, much more complicated. One of the most striking effects of the recession is on gender balance in the workplace. Last year, 80% of people laid off were men. And because 46% of America's workers are already women, some predict that the downturn could lead to women overtaking men as a share of the workforce. How people fare also depends on what job they do. Last year, 1.8 million jobs were lost in production, construction and transport industries, whilst 500,000 jobs were created in science, engineering, management and the professions. But the economic pain is also geographically uneven. Amongst those states faring worst, what's being called the slump belt, the manufacturing states that run from the industrial Midwest down into the Carolinas, whilst the Northeast, with its professional and creative centres, is much better insulated. Someone who's written with great insight about these huge trends is author and journalist Richard Florida. I spoke to him earlier today from Toronto. Richard, thanks for coming on the programme. You wrote a very chunky article for The Atlantic, how the crash will reshape America. Big questions, and what's the answer?
Well, I think every crash has reshaped America. The crash in the 1870s moved America from an agricultural society to an industrial city society. The crash in the 1930s, really the solution to the crash wasn't just Keynesianism and the war effort. It brought us the suburbanization and mass consumption. The crash today is going to change America's geography. And one of the things I point out is that when many people think New York's going to take a big hit, it'll take a hit, but it's a widely creative and diverse and big economy. It's those older Rust Belt cities like Detroit and Cleveland and Buffalo, and also the sprawling Sun Belt cities that grew mainly by real estate that are going to take the biggest hit in the years and decades ahead.
So would you say that the crash that we're living through at the moment is essentially a shock therapy that accelerates existing social and economic trends, or does it create something completely new?
Well, I think it's a reset. That's the word I like, and a number of people are using it. It really accentuates trends that have been going on over the past 2 decades, but it resets them in a new way. And I think just like no one could anticipate, say, in 1929, that the burgeoning trends towards people living a little bit outside the city boundaries in the then new suburbs would turn into this massive suburban sprawl, which would create demands for those industrial products. I think today most people don't anticipate the major changes in where and how we live. And I think the solution to economic recovery isn't just a stimulus. It isn't just creating more consumer demand or even restructuring industries. It's going to take a widespread and fundamental change in the way and how we live in our geography. That's what's going to create the new demand, the new consumer patterns, and the new patterns for industries to emerge.
In your article, you talk about clusters of expertise, of professional culture. Do you think then perhaps that we will see the end of suburban and exurban living in America as a result of the crash? People will move back into the big cities, living in more crowded conditions, perhaps working from home, using their cars less to drive to the office, that kind of stuff.
I think we'll see that a little bit, but the history of capitalism is a history of the more intensive use of our space. We went from that agricultural village to the big industrial city, went to the industrial city to the suburb and the city, which was a bigger geography. I think what we're going to see is, if you think about the Boston, New York, Washington corridor, that's an example of what I'm calling a mega region. We're going to see that whole mega region grow and become more compact and denser, not just in the Boston, Washington corridor, in Southern California, Northern California, the area around Chicago, and also similar mega regions around the world.
Richard, with all these men being laid off in the crash, could one say that we're seeing the next chapter of the feminist revolution?
Well, we just might be. If you look back over the past several recessions, you see that manufacturing jobs, industrial jobs, the jobs that men have typically had and seen themselves as breadwinners, they're the ones that get killed, double-digit unemployment figures. But jobs in which women predominate, on the high end, those professional jobs, particularly in healthcare and education, but also on the low end in service work, those jobs have been far more stable. I think coming out of this recession, you're likely to see women be predominant in the workforce and men fall slightly further behind. As those new job categories of professional and creative work and service jobs continue to grow and manufacturing jobs become less likely and less stable.
Last night, Barack Obama, in his soaring address, talked about America rising from the ashes like a phoenix. Do you think it will?
Well, I'll tell you, I was very, very, very much taken, and I thought the president's address hit every single right note I think parts of America will grow like a phoenix again. I think those big city centers from New York to Chicago to San Francisco and Boston, Atlanta, and maybe even a place like Miami. But I think some of the older industrial cities and some of those sprawling Sunbelt centers and some of the suburbs are in for a rough go.
Richard Florida, thank you very much indeed.